Let's try and make a sense of what President Trump did overnight, so you have a full sense of what's really happened, the India-specific exemptions that have also been rolled out, and then we'll try and dissect how this impacts us. So American President Donald Trump put out his tariff plan late last night, India time. Trump slammed what he called discounted tariffs on multiple countries, including India. The American president has announced 26% reciprocal tariffs on India in return for India allegedly imposing a 52% tariff on US imports. Trump called Prime Minister Modi a great friend. Trump says India's tariffs are tough and they've not been treating the United States right. In the first response from the Indian government said the tariffs are a mixed bag, not a setback, and that India will address concerns with the United States. There's no important silver lining for India. Several key sectors are exempted from tariffs. This includes pharma products, semiconductor chips, copper, lumber articles, and critical minerals. Trump told the world that they need to reduce tariffs as much as possible and is basically pushing for countries like India to reduce tariffs. To try and make sense of what's at play, how this impacts the India growth story, how this impacts different sectors of the Indian economy that export to the United States, and how this impacts global growth and American growth, and then the impact on Indian growth. We'll talk about all of that. I want to go across to business presenter Siddharth Zarabi. He joins us this morning. Siddharth, try and give our viewers a sense of the impact on Indian consumers, on Indian companies, of the tariffs that Donald Trump rolled out late last night.
Well, morning, Rahul, and clearly while President Trump talks about Liberation Day, one wonders whether he's kind of set in place the first of a major recession in his very first year in government, because clearly the tariffs are very sweeping. And I would start by saying that there is no reciprocity in the basic concept, because remember how they are stacked up. There is a 10% uniform tariff across the globe, across everything. So that's for starters. So even countries, including those that do not levy any import tariffs on US goods, now have gone from 0 straight away to 10%. That's the first slab. The second slab is country specific. And if you see that stack that he held up, India is ranked 10th on that list in terms of the percentage of duties that he proposes to impose. The very calculation, Rahul, of how this percentage has been calculated, for example, the number that was bandied about for India includes tariffs which are import duties and domestic taxes like GST, or what is called overseas the value added tax. Now, this is confounding economists because you can't club them together. GST is applicable both on domestic as well as all kinds of production. So let's leave that math aside. The big impact for India really is that I would say it's an opportunity. Why do I say that? There are 2 points. The first you mentioned, pharmaceuticals as an exemption. He's not doing it to do any favor to India. It's basically because of the realization that the US and its huge medical burden would suffer if pharmaceuticals became expensive. Copper, semiconductors, energy, these are very core and critical to the US economy, including lumber. Houses in the United States are made of timber. So he's been very, very case specific with regard to the exemptions. There is a silver lining for 1 or 2 sectors for India. But there is an opportunity, Rahul, and I'll quickly summarize it before I toss it back to you. Look at the tariffs on countries like Vietnam, on Bangladesh, and other East Asian tigers who have built up their economies in a free world trade order at the cost of Indian exports. If you look at it vis-a-vis them, our exports, assuming that there will be a full absorption of the 26% levy, will be more cheaper. And look at what will happen to the currency. Therefore, there is an opportunity for India. And finally, we know that with the advanced level of conversation between India and the United States, and we are amongst the few countries who have put a formal BIT with the United States on the table, I think there is a silver lining beyond the short-term pain, Rahul.
Okay, I want to get some experts from both the United States and India to talk about the impact of these Trump tariffs. But before I do that, I want to give you a flavor in case you missed that press conference late at night. I want to give you a flavor of what Donald Trump said in what he described as Liberation Day. It's anything but. Remember, the last time an American president tried protectionist tariffs was way back in 1930. This is when the Great Depression was already on, and those protectionist measures actually worsened the global depression. And therefore, what Trump is doing, all economic literature suggests, is counterproductive. It doesn't work, but it makes for good politics amongst his MAGA supporters, and that's why Trump is pushing through. He's convinced he's doing the right thing. Every sensible person, every economist, though, convinced that this is going to be disastrous. So let's listen to President Trump, and then we'll try and make sense of the impact this is likely to have on countries like India.
India, very, very tough, very, very tough. The Prime Minister just left. And he's a great friend of mine, but I said, you're a friend of mine, but you're not treating us right. They charge us 52%. You have to understand, we charge them almost nothing. For years and years, the United States charges other countries only a 2.4 tariff on motorcycles. Meanwhile, Thailand and others are charging much higher prices, like 60%. India charges 70%. Vietnam charges 75%, and others are even higher than that. Likewise, until today, the United States has for decades charged a 2.5 tariff. Think of that, 2.5% on foreign-made automobiles. The European Union charges us more than 10% tariffs, and they have 20% VAT's much, much higher. India charges 70%, and perhaps worst of all are the non-monetary restrictions imposed by South Korea, Japan, and very many other nations. As a result of these colossal trade barriers, 81% of the cars in South Korea are made in South Korea. 94% of the cars in Japan are made in Japan. Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. Likewise to all of the foreign presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, ambassadors, and everyone else who will soon be calling to ask for exemptions from these tariffs, I say, terminate your own tariffs, drop your barriers, don't manipulate your currencies. They manipulate their currencies like nobody can even believe, which is a bad, bad thing and very devastating to us, and start buying tens of billions of dollars of American goods. Tariffs give our country protection against those that would do us economic harm, and many people were looking to do us economic harm. Maybe not so obviously, but they were doing tremendous economic harm. But even more importantly, they will give us growth. These tariffs are going to give us growth like you haven't seen before. I call this kind reciprocal. This is not full reciprocal. This is kind reciprocal. But what we do is we cut it in half. We charge them. My answer is very simple if they complain. If you want your tariff rate to be zero, then you build your product right here in America, because there is no tariff if you build your plant, your product in America. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen, and they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. Thank you.
Okay, we're joined on this broadcast once again by Professor Andrew Latham. He's a distinguished scholar of international security at the Lancaster College. I have Arun Sharma. He is a senior non-resident fellow, chair on India and emerging Asian economies at CSIS. I have Sushant Sareen from the Observer Research Foundation, and I have P.N. Vijay, who's an investment banker and has worked closely in different capacities with his government. I have Rohit Sharma joining us from Washington, D.C. I want to go across to our colleague Rohit first. Rohit, what's been the buzz in the U.S. media on the back of this big dramatic press conference? I saw Goldman Sachs has increased the probability of America going into recession. So the general sense amongst all banks, investment houses, economists is that this is disastrous for the U.S. economy in terms of growth, and yet Trump seems determined to bash on.
Absolutely, Rahul. I think, JP Morgan analyst, I think they came up with a report and they said, US will probably go into recession. They gave a 40% chance of US going into recession. They said it's probably going to hike taxes on Americans by $660 billion a year. And, Donald Trump has not, listened to anybody on this. I think he wanted to do this for the last 40 years by his own admission. He said he was a young guy when he first talked about it. So I think, in all, he wanted to give it a shot. He wanted to give it a try. I mean, people are talking about how they've calculated tariffs. It's the formula is out there, and it's not even reciprocal at this point in time, is what some of the analysts have come out and said. So I think in general public, media, people are confused, apprehensions, anxious. We do not know what the stock markets will look like tomorrow morning. And in all sincerity, even some party members, are trying to come out and showing signs of, especially the ones who are going to probably go to election next year, showing signs of anxiousness as to what this would lead to. Now, one of the things in the executive order is that he can rescind these tariffs when he wants to. But from the looks of it and what he said before, is that he would want to give it a shot in the long run. He thinks they can raise $6 trillion over the next 10 years. And this will probably bring back manufacturing jobs into America and trying to play into the politics, the domestic politics of America. He also believes this would also allow America to reduce the deficit. So nobody knows. This is an uncharted territory, but Donald Trump and his cabinet believes in it. And as far as American media is concerned, Rahul, we're not seeing too much positive coverage at this point in time.
Rohit Sharma, I'll leave it there. Thank you for joining us. Professor Andrew Latham, I benefited from your insights when we spoke before Donald Trump announced these tariffs, and you said it's impossible to get into the man's head. Now that we've seen what he's announced, can you just begin by explaining to everyone watching what you think is the most likely impact on the American economy? Donald Trump thinks this will bring manufacturing back to the United States. A lot of economists are convinced that it won't. Explain why you think these tariffs might or might not work. Professor Latham.
Well, they won't work because they're premised on a false assumption and frankly, economic illiteracy. This is not 1913 and it's not 1930. It's 2025. And these tariffs, whether they're merely a bargaining chip, sometimes he frames it that way, but at a deeper level, President Trump is framing this as we're going to create a tariff walls that will bring manufacturing back to the United States. But he seems to think this is going to happen in the next 3 or 4 months, which is why he keeps giving a month reprieve and another month reprieve, as if you can stand up a factory to manufacture automobile parts in 30 days. It's completely ridiculous. And then the other silly slash scary assumption he's making is that somehow he can do away with the income tax and replace it with the income from tariffs, which was Hamilton's view back in 1913. The difference is, back in 1913, of course, the federal government was just basically the armed forces and the post office. You could finance it that way. But this federal government in the United States is huge. You cannot finance it through tariffs and doing away with income tax and corporate taxes and whatnot. And, he came into office making a promise. He was going to reduce taxes. He was going to improve, enhance the sort of cost of living. $6 trillion over 10 years, which is what he's talking about in terms of the tariffs, in fact, is a tax. And every time you hear the word tariff, you need to hear the word tax as well. This is a $6 trillion tax increase. His base, they're going to cheer him in the short term. But in
Professor
the
Latham, a lot of economists are saying that this is going to lead America into recession. What is the probability, in your view, of America slipping into recession? How soon is this likely to happen? And if America slips into recession, what is the impact, in your view, on global growth and the consequential impact on the growth of countries like India?
We're already seeing the stock market taking a nosedive. We're likely to see Americans pulling back in terms of purchasing things, buying things. So that's going to result in a contraction of the American economy. That's bad for Americans, but it's also bad for the world because this country is a huge market. And if the market contracts, as it's going to, as it's already started to, it's going to have a huge impact, not just on the United States and American citizens, but on Indians and Canadians and Europeans and Thais, and I can obviously go on. Everybody who sells into the U.S. is going to find a much smaller marketplace. And that, in fact, in turn, rather, is going to have an impact on their own domestic production. If you're selling pineapples to the United States and Americans are buying fewer pineapples, that's going to have a negative impact on your economy.
Sushant Sareen, you've been studying the potential impact of Trump's tariffs. For everyone watching this morning, try and explain how this is likely to impact Indian companies exporting to the US.
No, I'm guessing that the
Sushant?
people. Can you hear me, Rahul? Can you hear me?
I hear you well.
Okay. So, Rahul, it depends upon the various companies that are exporting to the United States. I'm sure they're going to be, bringing out their calculators. Now, we don't know whether these tariffs are an across the board 26% tariff, which is being levied, or is it going to be differentiated according to different sectors? But I think at one level, to the extent that it impacts upon US demand and the demand goes down, it will have some impact. But I think in relative terms, because these tariffs are not just on India, but they're on all the countries. So, for example, if we are exporting textiles or garments to the United States, the tariffs on the Bangladeshis are, I believe, 37% now. On the Pakistanis, about 29%. These are also big exporters to the United States. India is just 26%. So maybe there are some margins out there for us. On Vietnam, it goes up to almost 44% thereabouts. So maybe there is space for us. Our dilemma will be the same as the US dilemma. Just because Donald Trump is imposing massive tariffs on his major trade partners, does that mean, as Professor Latham was saying, does that mean that manufacturing will go back? Maybe some manufacturing will go back. But will the Americans start manufacturing garments from tomorrow, right? They're not going to do that. Will they start manufacturing Nike shoes from tomorrow? Or any of those other US companies which have invested in factories abroad and using low manufacturing base, which is basic common economics 101, that as a nation becomes advanced technologically, it moves up the value chain, and things which are lower down the value chain move to other countries, which is what happened in China, for example. The Chinese didn't start making high-tech stuff when they started off their economic reforms program. They have now moved over the last 7, 8, 10 years, they moved into the high-tech and really advanced economic stuff, engineering goods. They didn't move out there overnight. Can the US now go back down the value chain? I don't think that's going to be possible. So it's certainly going to impact upon the US market, demand in the US, because the cost of things will go up. But how does it disrupt international trade? And to the extent that it disrupts international trade, there will be an impact on us, because almost 45-46% of Indian GDP comes from foreign trade. And if foreign trade across the globe is going to get disrupted really badly, and it is going to get disrupted, I think that's a no-brainer, then certainly it will have some deleterious effects on the Indian economy and Indian companies as well. But I don't think it is a single dimensional thing. The tariffs have gone up, and so the Indian companies are going to be in a lot of trouble. I'm sure, given the kind of stupidity which happens in stock markets, where, suddenly sentiments lead to massive rises or spikes and massive falls, probably the stock markets are going to take a beating today. But I don't think in the aggregate, it's going to have a very, very significant impact on the Indian economy itself, simply because we are not alone in this. Okay. There are many other countries.
I want to give our viewers a framework on how to think about this. There are two kinds of broad exports, right? One is say business to business, B2B. If it's B2B, then the margins typically, and we're speaking to some leading lights of India Inc. who made this point, that the margins typically in B2B exports are thinner, and therefore the ability to absorb the extra tariffs are lesser because it's extremely competitive. But if you have, say, some kind of B2C, business to consumer exports, which are directly to the consumer, there the prospects of being able to increase the price at which you sell might be higher because you've got some you've got some flexibility there because you're selling directly to the consumer, and especially if your brands have some salience. But if you're in the B2B sector, then it really squeezes your margins even further, and the ability to increase prices is not that flexible. Arun Sharma, what are you hearing about conversations between Lutnick, the US Commerce Secretary, our Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal, the US Trade Representative, our commerce officials, in terms of trying to get the bilateral trade agreement done before fall? Is that likely to happen? And if it does, how might that impact the tariffs that Trump announced last night?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Rahul. There is one good, I would say, omen for India that Mr. Lutnick is serious about the discussions. The fact that he participated, I guess, in your conclave, a few weeks ago, the fact that President Trump went out of his way to reiterate his friendship with Prime Minister Modi, the fact that India is one of the few bright spots in terms of friendly relations the United States has with large countries, I think all augur well. But there is also the reality of national interest. The Commerce Ministry came out this morning saying that we are analyzing this 27, and they also gave a very important signal that we should not ignore. They said it is a mixed bag, not a setback. I think we have to read a very positive and I would say promising message there that clearly the backline conversations are not catastrophic by any means, and certainly not of the attitude and the reaction that the closest allies of the United States have had with this. Prime Minister Carney said, look, we are going to take forceful and decisive countermeasures. Australia said this is not an act of a friend. Multiple other countries and close allies of the United States have come back with very strong reactions. India has not. And I think that is probably a pretty good signal to us who are not involved in the direct conversations on taking a more positive view on how these progress towards a bilateral trade agreement will evolve. The other thing that's, I think, important to analyze is that there is a different level of tariff in different sectors, that what we call the tariff gap between the difference between what our certain sectors face already versus what they will now face. And I think that's something that also gives some positive indication. And what really matters is which are the sectors that are high export and which are low. For example, Prime Minister Modi was very smart, in my view, in saying, fine, we'll reduce the road duty on Harley motorcycles. How many Harleys are bought by India? So what impact does that make on an overall basis? So I think it's very important also to get a little micro into the analysis as to how much are we exporting to India in which sector, and what is the exact tariff gap that's going to be impacting when the new tariffs take place.
PM Vijay, there was a sense or there was a hope in some sectors that because of the equation between Prime Minister Modi and American President Trump, that India would somehow be able to avoid these tariffs. Also because India was moving with speed, already reducing some taxes during the budget, signaling that it was willing to reduce more. We were hoping at one level to stave off. The more realistic people in government knew that that's not going to happen, but there was an expectation that we may be able to stave off these taxes. That hasn't happened. Do you see that as being a setback to those who are trying to ensure that India would be exempted from Trump's tariffs?
No, I think that was an unrealistic expectation. I'm not at all surprised that India was not expected. There was no way in which, a president who has made this an article of faith in his policy and his approach, where he has imposed tariffs on his closest allies like Canada, Mexico, who are part of NAFTA, and he's torn up that agreement. So he was not going to make that change just for the sake of goodwill alone. There is a strategic relationship, and where the exemptions are needed for the United States, he has made them. Pharma is a big example. He cannot afford to increase the prices of essential drugs in the United States. It's a political suicide. He's not going to do that. Similarly, critical minerals. I mean, you cannot afford this, tech industry to collapse because of the lack of critical minerals. So where the exemptions had to be made, they've already been made. I think now it's a question of really where do we go from here? And that's going to be a line by line hard negotiation between Secretary Lutnick and team and the USTR and the Indian Commerce Ministry as we go forward. So I guess we all have to stay tuned.
So, PN Vijay, it's a very tricky situation for India to be in. On the one side, Donald Trump keeps saying Prime Minister Modi is my friend. India is very tough. They charge us too many tariffs. And while he makes exemptions for what is politically important for him, like critical minerals and the pharmaceutical sector, he wants India to reduce that USTR, US Trade Representative report, when it spoke of non-tariff barriers, spoke of India having to, they were objecting to minimum support price on food grains, on food products, which are impossible for any government to reduce. So he's being politically expedient himself and pushing India towards the wall on what he thinks is important for American companies. You're dealing with a mercantilist. Mr. Vijay?
Thank you. Good morning. I think we need to dimension this problem without getting too excited about it. We exported about $85 billion of goods last year to the U.S. And if you take away pharmaceuticals and energy products, it works out to about $60 billion. So 25% of that will be about $15 to $20 billion, which is less than 0.5% of India's GDP. So if one is talking about the impact on Indian exports to the US, it is much less than for, say, China, South Korea, Japan, Vietnam, or Bangladesh, or practically anybody else. Which is why if you saw the stock market has literally shrugged this off, losing less than 0.5% after the good rise they had yesterday. Now, the bigger issue here is, I think, that what does India do from here? And I think it's a great opportunity for India, because we have a situation where, at least in the headlines, people are worried. Though, frankly, I think a bad monsoon will be much, much more devastating to the Indian economy than this impact on less than 0.5% of the GDP. But there's an impact effect. People are having special shows about it. People are talking about it. So the Indian government can push through what it claims to do, which is ease of doing business, reducing unnecessary procedures, taxes, etc., and which are good for the country. After all, why do we need so many of this? Finally, where is the Indian consumer? People talk so much about the American consumer. What about the Indian consumer? Of course, the Indian consumer stands to gain when these tariffs are down. And I think the mature response of the Indian government was good. It said it is not a setback. We are looking at it. I think we should negotiate with the Americans, and as a policy, bring down the tariffs and non-tariff barriers, the QRs, etc., to make ourselves globally competitive. And I think it can be a win-win for us. And I do not share the views of people who think it is a disaster for India. It is not at all. And I think I take this more as an opportunity to set our...
No, but let me push back, because the thinking in government, PN Vijay, so far was we need to build an Atmanirbhar Bharat. We need to encourage domestic manufacturing, which is why a lot of Indian automobile manufacturers were encouraged to set up plants for for EV cars, EV motorcycles, and they did that. Whether it's the Tatas, the Mahindras, the JSW, several groups did that. Now, suddenly, if you reduce import duties on EVs and Teslas become cheaper, BYDs become cheaper, then all these companies that have spent so much money in building these capacities, hoping to cash in on Prime Minister Modi's Make in India, Atmanirbhar Bharat push, now because you're trying to cozy up to the likes of Elon Musk and make him calm down, that's very problematic.
Rahul, 95% of cars sold in India are less than 15 lakhs. You think Tesla coming to India is going to affect the Indian automobile industry? Are we joking? You think Bourbon coming into India is going to affect a Harley?
No, but BYD will.
It will
No. BYD will. If BYD can, sir, look at what's happening. No, that's not fair. Look at what's happened in Europe. Look at what's happening elsewhere where Tesla is being impacted. Companies like BYD can sell high tech at low cost. And if they're allowed to import, if those cars can be imported into India with very low import duties, which is what Tesla is pushing for, you can't make a Tesla specific exemption. If it happens, then it's kind of available to all companies. And that's where the challenges start. And that's a real concern the Indian government needs to look at.
BYD, Hyundai is already there. If you see global prices of Hyundai EVs and BYD, it's almost the same. So we already have Tata's producing the EVs. BYD is very good for the Indian consumer. Why don't we look at it this way?
Sure. Yeah, it's good for Indian consumer. But Siddharth, I want to bring you into this. The fact is, I'm just saying that you've been pushing in one direction. You've been signaling to Indian automobile manufacturers, for example, that double down on Atmanirbhar Bharat, Make in India, and they've done that. They've put in real capacity expansion plans and built up these manufacturing facilities. And now suddenly, because of reasons beyond the control of the Indian government, there is pressure to reduce taxes. And the fact is, if a Mahindra car is competing with a much cheaper BYD car, it throws, for the consumer it's great, but if the companies that have built these capacities, it's problematic.
Well, Rahul, the way I would like to answer this question is that what's the broader picture here, sector by sector? And we are already getting analysis. If we take a look at the markets, pharma stocks up, obviously reacting positively to the fact that pharmaceutical exports have been exempted. We are seeing a broader reaction, as was just mentioned, which is far more mature than the earlier fears of a complete washout. But to your question, for the first two Modi terms, we clearly had a policy of import substitution under the rubric of Make in India. Within the last 3-4 months, we have seen the government of India being completely cognizant and aware of the changing terms of trade that President Trump was going to usher in. And this is just, I think, one of the key chapters of a battle that will continue to play out. Therefore, for the government of India and our domestic producers, the challenge is to move away from relying on tariffs as a tool to get import substitution done. Laptops, mobile phones, electronics, there are so many categories. We have not been able to do import substitution in crude oil or gold for that matter. Several initiatives with regard to reducing our dependence on gold imports have not really succeeded. So the net effect is that we are now almost 35 years after India and Indian companies started to gain from the World Trade Order, a rules-based order of negotiated trade interactions and a global pact. We will now have to move towards bilateral trade agreements. It is every country for itself and every sector for itself. And wherever there are sectors in our economy where, to your point, Rahul, which have been benefiting from the fact that foreigners and foreign producers have been hit with higher tariffs, they will have to pull up their socks. And one final point, I think some of the tonality in what the US is doing has been very unfair to India. And why do I say that? India, in terms of our foreign direct investment rules, is amongst the most open economies in the world. And it is surprising that the USTR has perhaps not fully absorbed that. Compare it with China. We are one of the most open economies, insurance being one of the latest examples. Import tariffs were for protecting our domestic economy. The fundamental error in the US way of thinking is that all companies will move to the US. I think what you have seen, including the most recent rapprochement or signals of that with China, it will be every country fending for itself. And that is going to be the new world trade order after the disorder that Trump has introduced.
I want to talk about a new Nomura research report that's put out. This looks at the impact on the Indian IT sector. They've reduced target prices of several of the Indian IT stocks between 3 and 21%, saying that sales growth for large IT companies could be cut by about 230 to 350 basis points. Tariffs, Nomura suggests, may impact revenue growth, slow decision-making for clients in the United States. So they've slashed the outlook for Infosys, Wipro, Tech Mahindra by between 10 and 14%. Arun Sharma, that's a real concern. The fact that in any case, because of artificial intelligence, the whole IT sector, which is one of India's key exporters to the United States, IT services sector, is going through a lot of churn. A lot which was being done by engineers now being done through AI. And in the midst of that, you've got Trump putting these tariffs. And if that gets impacted, that then starts impacting real jobs. Because these IT companies currently employ lakhs of engineers, both in India, the US, and elsewhere. That's where it starts to hit home.
Yeah, so I think Nomura's report is focusing on something that we should be discussing more, which is the impact on the domestic economy of the United States of these tariffs. I think many of the panelists have said that the supply response or the manufacturing response is not automatic. There are many structural aspects to manufacturing moving. And so clearly, if you see, nobody's really celebrating, even those people who you would expect to benefit from these tariffs in the United States. You hardly see anything in the media saying anybody's really welcoming. In fact, the US Chamber of Commerce came out and said this is going to be very negative for the US economy. So, and this prediction of potential sort of downside effects on the Indian IT sector is really based on the fact that the two or three things are likely to happen. One, that the capex and the IT investment plans are going to be certainly watered down as people want to do a wait and watch on how the overall businesses are going to perform. So one of the first things gets cut is the IT budget. That's number one. Number two is that their ability to expand and deliver various services is going to be impacted potentially by the decline in the consumer sentiment. That's number two. Number three is the inflationary pressure. Again, because if inflation goes up because of the higher prices passed on to consumers, there's a chance that the Fed will have to deal with this by raising interest rates, which will again point all to what Goldman Sachs has been pointing to, a 35% probability of a recession. It may be even more and sooner than we expect because of the sentiment. So I think that is certainly a risk for India and the world for that matter, because this is going to then ripple down. We are, like it or not, in a very globalized economy. We are producing globally, we are buying globally, we are trading globally, our logistics are global. So there is no real domestic economy left in the world per se. So when we disrupt one economy, we disrupt everybody, and that's in my view, that's the biggest risk, that we have a slower global trade growth.
Let's take a look at how the Indian stock markets are reacting. I'm joined on this broadcast now by Business Today's Chief Market Analyst Shailendra Bhatnagar. Shailendra, give our viewers a sectoral sense of which sectors the markets feel are most negatively impacted and which seem to have come out relieved that they've been exempted from Trump's tariff barrage.
So, good morning, Rahul, and thank you for having me over. It's a very, very exciting day on the Indian markets. The knee jerk that happened in the morning seems to be bought into. Apart from two or three negative counters such as Tata Motors, which see a lot of their JLR exports going to the US, which will be hit by that 25% uptick on tariffs. The mood is fairly buoyant. Pharma across the board is jumping with glee. The index itself is up 4% because no tariffs have been imposed by the US on pharma imports. So look at how Aurobindo Pharma is doing. Look at how Zydus Life, Dr. Reddy's are just burning rubber as far as markets are concerned. But for the moment, there is a spot of cheer in textiles as well, because countries like Vietnam, countries like Bangladesh, who were our major competitors in this space, have been hit by higher tariffs compared with India. So look at Gokuldas exports, up circuit 5%. Look at other exporters in the textile space doing pretty well. But pharma is a clear winner. Auto ancillaries are clear losers, and to some extent even Tata Motors. Rahul.
Let's spend a moment thinking of how this impacts you and I. For example, if you're planning to buy a new car, and if, especially if this is, something that you're thinking about in terms of buying an imported car. Siddharth Zarabi, does it just make sense for Indian consumers to hold off? Because if these customs duties on cars come down, whether it's a Tesla or anything else that you wish to buy, could it impact car sales as consumers get into this wait and watch kind of mode कि देखते हैं कि tax कम होगा तब जाके खरीदेंगे? It doesn't make sense to go and buy right now.
Rahul, very good point. And before I answer that, let me just point out one very important thing for our viewers that we have just noticed as we go through the fine print of the order. The actual order of tariffs says India's tariff is 27% and not 26%. And why I mention this is that just look at the nature in which this rather haphazard imposition has happened. So perhaps sanity will prevail in the United States going forward. But on the issue of sectoral impact, it's very clear that despite what the US has done, India has not surrendered its power to levy anti-dumping duties. Why do I say this? Because if there is any dumping, for example, the steel sector is very fearful of what might happen on account of a flood of cheaper Chinese imports or other country imports impacting it. That same logic will apply across sectors. So, is there a sort of major discount offer that is likely across sectors? I do not see that happening in the near term or in the long term. The challenge, of course, is for domestic producers to match up to potential rivals like BYD. You made that point. In the electric vehicle space, technology will drive competition and pricing cannot drive competition in the Indian market. The Indian market is unique. It has a super premium category and it has a mass category. And therefore, technology, better features may drive, pricing will not drive it. And the government of India retains the power to levy anti-dumping duties on any sector, any country where it feels that domestic producers are likely to get hurt. Rahul.
I want to give you a sense of what the different research reports are saying. Morgan Stanley's put out a report saying they prefer India but remain cautious on Taiwan, Japan, South Korea. Those economies far more dependent on exports than India is. Bernstein's put out a report where they say heavy tariffs on India will not sustain. Rates may not sustain in the second half of 2025. IT services and pharmaceuticals are untouched, Bernstein says, by this announcement. We don't see the trade war escalating. Now, this becomes important, Professor Latham. How much of this is now cast in stone and how much is really a negotiating gambit that, impose such stiff tariffs that the world, countries across the world come under pressure and start pulling back their own tariffs? And to what extent do you think Donald Trump is now determined to stay this course? Or is it frankly, as you said last time when you came, impossible to get into his head and know what he wants?
Well, it is impossible to know what he's thinking, but there are two tendencies at play here. One of which is you might interpret all of this as really doubling down on the neoliberal free trade project from the post-Cold War era. He's really using tariffs as a cudgel to beat everybody into reducing their tariffs and therefore doubling down on that neoliberal free trade project. But the other tendency is quite the opposite, which is, free trade has not worked in to America's advantage, and therefore what we need to do is build Fortress America. And adjacent to that line of argumentation is this. There are two ways in which countries have responded to Trump's tariffs, one of which, I'm Canadian, I confess, even though I live in the U.S., one of which is to declare war on the United States. And to really, Canadian liquor distributors, which are state-owned, provincially owned, have pulled all American booze off the shelves. And that's just the tip of a very big iceberg. Canada has declared war on Trump, who's declared war on Canada. The other approach, though, is the Indian approach, which is, can we do a deal? Can we find some way of, to use a Canadianism, stick handling this, negotiating and navigating this, so we don't suffer the worst consequences? And I'm not sure which approach is better. The Canadians are really, really up for a big fight. India, it seems to me, is up for, let's do a deal. And those are two very different strategies in terms of dealing with the Trump tariffs.
Well, that's where Prime Minister Modi's Gujarati DNA and the desire to cut a deal, Sushant Sareen, may come handy. That why get into a lafda with a much bigger economy? Let's figure out how we can just stay calm, keep our heads cool, and get across the finishing line on a bilateral trade agreement as soon as possible.
But that's the smart thing to do, isn't it, Rahul? The United States is a much bigger economy, and we have a very profitable and a fruitful trading relationship with the United States. Why the hell would we want to get into a massive trade war with the US? Now, the Canadians are Canadians are getting into all kinds of scraps with all kinds of countries, anyways. So they can get into a scrap with the US as well. But does it suit India's interest to have a kind of a negotiated trade deal with the US, or does it make sense for us to, go into a kind of a rage and then say, okay, fine, we are now going to retaliate against the US? How does that serve our interest? So I think what we are trying to do is the sensible approach of trying and navigating through this new mess in global trading relationships which are going to come. And I think, I don't know who it was, but yes, the old WTO-based order is breaking down. So you will have bilateral trading arrangements with most of the countries, which is what we are getting into. But there are two impacts, Rahul, which I think we need to take into account. One is the geostrategic, geopolitical impact. And that is the so-called US leadership of the world as the paramount power. What does this kind of a trading war do to that position of the United States vis-a-vis its allies, vis-a-vis other countries which were also trying to get close to the US or which had a stake in the US market? Now, the US domination was not just military, it was also the US dollar, and it was also the attractiveness of the US market. Now, if both these things are going to start coming into under strain, how does that impact the primacy of the United States around the world? Not immediately, but in the next 5 years. Second is the India impact. Now, how many Teslas can they sell in India? Yaar? Come on. At the very cheapest, it's going to be 70 lakhs of rupees. Maybe, Rahul, you can afford it. I can't. I don't think I'll ever be able to afford a car like that, right? So I am going to go for my, at best, maybe 10, 15, 20 lakh rupee car. Okay, on a, maybe on a 5-year, 7-year loan. I can't afford a Tesla. I don't give a damn whether the Tesla comes for 70 lakhs or 1 crore. I don't care. They can make as many cars as they want to make in India. It doesn't matter to me. Same is the thing with Harley Davidson. We were being stupid by levying the kind of taxes we were levying on the Harley Davidson or on American whiskey. Rahul, you and I are both Punjabis. We love our Scotch whiskey. I am damned if I'm going to ever drink American whiskey or Canadian or any other whiskey, right? So why were we imposing 150% duty on that? For what reason? So when our trading, when our commerce ministry starts levying tariffs, do they even apply their mind to what they're trying to do? Or is it just, some babu sitting out there and suddenly gets a fancy that this is a sin good and I'm going to impose this kind of a tariff? So this kind of madness needs to stop. And I think the one thing that Mr. Vijay said earlier is the single most critical thing where I will keep taking shots at the government in India. This regulatory inspector Raj that we have in this country is the biggest millstone around the neck of the Indian productive class, the Indian entrepreneurial class. Until and unless you are going to get rid of this inspector Raj, that every two-bit, third-rate inspector can go into a business which is even following the law and extort money out of them, and nobody says anything about it, until and unless your state governments can shape up and start encouraging entrepreneurs to come and set up industry and not harass the hell out of them, please forget about making India one of the best investment destinations around the world. It's not going to happen. We have missed a lot of that investment coming into India, to Vietnam and some of the other countries which were much smarter than us and quicker than us in attracting those investments. Can we do it now? I don't know. I hope we wake up and we smell the coffee. Of course, Mr. Goyal can keep going around the world and saying India is the 4th biggest economy, 5th biggest economy. It means nothing to nobody. Until and unless you're going to open your economy and you are going to free your businessmen, I'm sorry, you would not have gotten the plot correct.
Okay, Sushant, A, I don't drink whiskey. B, I have the smallest car in the parking bay where our cars are parked, but I will deal with those barbs off air. For the time being, I have one last question for P and Vijay on why this could really be a big opportunity for a country like India. Just the fact that we reduce our regulatory cholesterol and we open up our trade arteries, production, manufacturing arteries. This may happen under duress because of what Trump is threatening and wanting to do. But the fact is, if it happens, it's net positive. And remember, in India, no liberalization, no economic reform ever happened because it was the right thing to do. Whether it's the reform from the 1990s, which Narasimha Rao and Manmohan Singh did, it happened at that time under duress from the International Monetary Fund. It could happen this time under pressure from Donald Trump, but net it might be good for India.
You're asking me, Rahul? Hello?
Yes, Mr. Vijay, I am.
Yes, I think I second your thoughts 100%. I think this is net an opportunity. If you look at the another interesting aspect is, whenever the US dollar has been weak, investments into India has surged. If you look at the last 10 years of the Indian markets and Indian remittances, a strong US dollar index which went up to 110, the Indian markets fell. As the US dollar has been falling due to Trump's which side over you are, smart or quixotic or whatever policies, the US dollar has slowed down because of fears of the US recession, which is the smart money is now saying, where can we go? And India seems to be the most domestic among the large economies and ipso facto the least affected by these tariffs. And so India is in a relatively sweet spot. If we can get our act together, if we can use this opportunity to remove the 60,000 compliances that somebody was talking about the other day, we can use this as a great opportunity to make our industry globally competitive. And let us not forget all this Harley Davidsons, all these Bourbons are just announcement effect. But what really matters is to make Indian industry globally competitive by reducing the shackles and controls and Inspector Raj, which we have brought on ourselves.
You know, we've had an insightful discussion. I want to thank our guests for joining us this morning and for staying up late at night tracking Donald Trump's press conference. Whenever this has been tried, there is enough historic economic literature which tells us this is boomerang. It boomeranged in the past, it will boomerang again. But Donald Trump is determined on committing harakiri and the rest of the world must deal with it. I think Prime Minister Modi and the Indian government has a smart approach. You know, instead of getting riled up and trying to fight with the school bully, just try and avoid him or get on his side. There's no point in getting into a war you cannot win. We will track developments through the day. We'll have more voices. I'll be back at 8 p.m. in the evening as we look at the impact of Donald Trump's tariffs and how Indian companies are looking at dealing with this new reality.